The Sudan, we come further down to Eswatini, where a new Human Rights Watch report titled "You Will Die Waiting for Justice" has exposed ongoing impunity for the brutal crackdown on protesters during Eswatini's June 2021 unrest. The report documents how security forces killed dozens and injured hundreds of other people, demanding democratic reforms. Yet, 4 years on, not a single officer has been held accountable. Human Rights Watch says victims and their families continue to face intimidation and silence as the government fails to deliver justice or acknowledge the scale of the abuses. We are now joined by the report's author, Noma Masiko-Mpaka, researcher at Africa Division of the Human Rights Watch. A very good evening to you, and thank you so much for speaking to us.
Good evening. Thank you so much for having me.
So let's just take it back a little to reflect on those uprisings and what exactly happened.
Yeah, so it all started with the death of a student at the University of Eswatini, Tabani Nongonyane, under very mysterious conditions, and then there was allegations of police involvement in his death, and that not being properly investigated, would then really culminated into student protests calling for justice and accountability for the student's death. And this then spread into wider calls for democracy. I think the younger generation in Eswatini at the time was frustrated with the way that things were in terms of civil and political rights, but also in terms of socioeconomic rights, where the king and just the king's family and the authorities generally are living lavish lifestyles while the rest are living in squalor. And this was really a call for not only socioeconomic changes, but also for reforms in terms of democratic processes in the country. And then what happened is that there were protests across the country, from the capital to smaller constituencies, where people were calling for democratic reforms in the country. And of course, then the police and the military responded with excessive and unwarranted force, killing, injuring people, and of course, breaking people's basic human rights. And we interviewed those who were victims of the abuse of the police and the military, some who were part of the protests, some who were passers-by, who were going about their daily lives as usual, coming back from school, coming back from work, and others who were actually completely isolated from, the protests altogether, who were then targeted because the police and the military were shooting indiscriminately at civilians, those who were part of the protest, but also those who were not.
So you say there were those who were targeted, but you also say at the same time that police were shooting indiscriminately. So those who were targeted, what was the reason for them being singled out?
So, it varied from case to case, because remember, in some instances, there were actual protests that were taking place where they were shooting indiscriminately. But there were also instances where, for example, one of the people we interviewed was, in a shop that was looted. And then they were in that shop assisting the shop owners to clean up the mess. They were young boys. The police came into the shop as these boys were cleaning at the request of the shop owner. The police then came and didn't ask them any questions about whether they had looted, what was happened. They just shot at them, for example. And this boy then is now in a wheelchair, has, is and is now a paraplegic as a result of that. So it all varies from incidences where there were large scale protests where they were shooting indiscriminately, but there were also instances where they would walk into situations where it's not that many people, but they will still target individuals because who happen to be quote unquote at the wrong place at the wrong time.
So it's not necessarily that there was some intelligence done on certain people and they were therefore hunted down and killed.
Not necessarily the case. I think there may have been instances once, a few who were part of the protest, those who were leading some of the protests. But I think there was also general, where the police were not exercising, any caution. We're just shooting indiscriminately, and just dispersing everybody and people were running in different directions, some getting caught in crossfire, some actually being targeted because there's certain assumptions. Maybe it's nighttime, it's after curfew, what are you doing at this time? They'll shoot at you. Like we had an individual who was an older man who was a security guard coming back from a night shift at night. The security forces said, as old as you are, what are you doing outside at this hour? They shot at him. And it was only afterwards that they actually ascertained that he was a security guard at 5 a.m. coming from a night shift. So I mean, whatever the case may be, I think the point here is that excessive use was used. It was unwarranted. And in any case where there's protest, there's supposed to be some kind of escalation of violence. You cannot start with the most lethal force, live ammunition. It needs to be scaled, and there should be an imminent threat. And in many instances, there was no imminent threat.
No, it's fine. I had to get clarity because you did make the statements that some were targeted and some were shot indiscriminately. So I just needed to understand exactly what is meant by that. But obviously, the riots were in protests of, in some cases, next to no democratic rights that are being exercised. But is it symptomatic or should I say emblematic of what is the state of human rights environment is in Eswatini?
Absolutely, on the money, because this is not happening in isolation, right? It's not just an isolated incident. It's happening in a context where there is a deteriorating human rights record in the country, where people's fundamental rights, socioeconomic, but of course civil and political in particular in this context, are infringed upon. So in a context where basic human rights are not respected and promoted, these kind of things, it provides, a conducive environment for such violations to not only take place, but also, years later for there to be no level of justice or accountability for the scores that were injured and harmed. So, we know that there's been no police officer or military officer who's, been, who's faced the arm of the law for what they've done. Nobody is being held accountable. It's just people who were violated and killed in their lives, fundamentally transformed, people who are living with disabilities that they were not born with because of, authorities, and nothing has been done about it. And I think that is the tragedy. Not only what happened in June 2021, but also what happened 4 years later, which is nothing.
So I'd imagine that there's been no effort then from the government, whether it be the justice system or state security, to investigate and prosecute the perpetrators.
Yeah, so what happened in October 2021 is that the Eswatini Human Rights Commission released a preliminary report which documented some of these violations. And then they released this report. Of course, it completely undercounted the number of violations, and they themselves admitted to this. I mean, the numbers are far higher than what they wrote in that report. But what we would have liked to see is that after the preliminary report was published in October 2021, that there'd be some kind of final report first. But secondly, there were some recommendations that the commission wrote to the government, and there's been no progress in terms of implementation of some of these recommendations. Of for example, an independent investigation to be conducted around the violations that took place, and of course issues of remedies and rehabilitation and reparations for the victims as well. So there are a number of recommendations that we as Human Rights Watch would support from the Commission that have 4 years later not been implemented. And I think a lot needs to be done in terms of following up on those recommendations, but also in terms of coming up with, really engaging with the victims. I think when we're talking about remedies for victims of such violations, it needs to be victim-centered. We need to understand what the needs of the victims are. If you've lost your limb and now you're unemployed, you're unable to fend for yourself, there's all these medical bills. I mean, I spoke to some of these, there's a young man who lives in the north, close to the border of Mozambique, in a very rural community where his parents are unemployed. He's now lost 2 years of school because of all the, the injury that he sustained. And, he now, he walks with a wheelchair. He needs to use, adult nappies. He has a catheter. There's all these medical needs that he can't afford in a context where, basic services are not delivered in Eswatini. So he's now has a burden, and the state needs to be intervening in those kind of instances. So when you're talking about justice and accountability, it's often just the basic needs of victims being met, access to medical care, access to psychosocial support. Because many of them, this has been a traumatic experience for them. Many were breadwinners. Now they're living at home, unemployed, hopeless, feeling like the world is going to end for them. So there's a lot of needs, and I think the government needs to come to the party and really heed to the needs of the victims.
Very disheartening and heartbreaking to hear, but thank you so much for speaking to us, Noma Masiko-Mpaka.